start early.
Conversations around democracy.
Must revisit the institutions of democracy.
Thank you for these discussions that you give different perspectives of the Swedish government to support democracy in Nigeria, but especially as I thank you for the cooperation with Yiaga.
Hello and welcome. If you're joining us you can see this feed. My name is Nabilah Usman, and this is the last of the E-Democracy Talks series, brought to you by the collaboration of Yiaga and the Embassy of Sweden in Nigeria. As you know, we began these conversations around democracy. Today, on the other hand, we will be looking at the role of civil society in democratic societies. I have two promising and engaging guests to have this conversation with, and I'm hoping that by the time we're done, we would have gleaned a couple of things, that would help push democracy forward, especially in Nigeria. On that particular note, without further ado, I'd like to welcome the Swedish ambassador to Nigeria, Paul Michael Grans, who will give his opening remarks, and then we can dig right into it. Ambassador, good afternoon and welcome.
Good afternoon, Nabilah. Thank you very much. Good to see you again. Feel
And
like
you as
old
well.
friend.
Yes, indeed.
Yes, and dear participants on Facebook and elsewhere, my name is Paul Michael Grans. I'm the Swedish ambassador to Nigeria, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all to this third edition of our Democracy Talks series with our partner Yiaga. And as you heard in the last 2 weeks, we had very important conversations, I think, around how to strengthen democracy in Nigeria and in Sweden and in other countries as well. Ideas that we hope to feed into the big democracy talk that the government in Sweden is planning for next year in Stockholm, 2021. And the first edition was about women's participation and then young people. And today, civil society is the focus of our discussions. And many thanks again to Yiaga and your team for the efficient coordination so far. And you, Nabilah Usman, have been a fantastic moderator, I think, of these talks. I would also like to mention that Plan International is one of our strong partners. We have worked quite a lot with them. So I'm looking forward to Dr. Abdu's presentation, as well as other speakers too later on. Efforts to support, defend and sustain the work of civil society organizations are fundamental in Swedish foreign policy and Swedish engagement to promote global development. And this priority is deeply grounded in a domestic tradition, I would say, in Sweden, a tradition of dialogue with civil society as a way to address shared challenges. And Sweden is committed to the promotion of laws, policies, and practices that foster an enabling environment for civil society, both domestically in Sweden, of course, and elsewhere in the world. And civil society is made up of individuals, actually, in groups and organizations working together for a common interest. It includes popular movements, women's groups, of course, environmental movements, cooperatives, but also religious communities, trade unions, and various associations. It's a very broad concept, actually, civil society. And a vibrant, active, and critical civil society all over the world is key to keep governments accountable. So it's very, very tightly linked to democracy and fundamental piece of democracy, say. And if I may have an initial thought in the beginning of today's discussions, I think that one of the limitations of civil societies in Nigeria might be the inability to come together under an umbrella framework that makes their demands too firm to be ignored. Just a general observation since I arrived in Nigeria last summer. Civil society organizations should also open their doors to more collaboration in between, rather than competition, I think, to get stronger when their goals are the same. I hope this conversation today will contribute to this and inspire civil society groups to be perhaps a little bit bolder. Working to strengthen civil society is especially important in the current situation when democracy is being challenged in more and more countries, and many organizations are being subjected to threats and pressure in different ways and restricted in their work through new and tougher laws. And finally, the Embassy of Sweden in Nigeria plans to continue to support various civil society groups, not only in our drive for democracy, but also in the respect for human rights and reduced poverty, support in humanitarian disasters, and other thematic priorities of the government of Sweden in Nigeria. Thank you very much. Looking forward to the presentations and the discussions afterwards. Thank you. Back to you, Nabilah.
Thank you. All right, so that was the ambassador laying a foundation for us, and I'm going to touch up on that and immediately introduce to you our guests who are already on the line. Now, as we know, civil society is widely understood as the space outside the family, market, and state. What constitutes civil society has developed and grown since the term first became popular in the 1980s. And it now signifies a wide range of organized and organic groups, including non-governmental organizations, that's NGOs. That includes NGOs, trade unions, social movements, grassroots organizations, online networks, and communities, and also faith groups. Now, civil society organizations are non-profits with an aim to convene people to pursue a wide range of shared interests in the public domain. They are often recognized as institutions that facilitate communication between citizens and policymakers by playing a vital role in enabling guaranteed rights, shaping development policies, and overseeing their implementation, as well as advancing collaborative governance. Generally, CSOs are devoid of government control and act as independent democracy actors. So, for instance, Yiaga happens to be falls under civil society organizations in Nigeria. Now, one thing that's very important about CSOs is that they fulfill important duties of checks and balances in democracies. They are able to influence the government and hold it accountable. Therefore, free and active civil societies are an indicator of a healthy participatory democracy. The Civicus, that is CIVICUS, in 2018 State of Civil Society, however, found that 109 out of 195 countries have closed, repressed, or obstructed the civic space. Open civic space is characterized by freedom of association, peaceful assembly, and freedom of expression. Civil society depends on these three key rights, which are often threatened by government, either through restrictive legislation or directives. For instance, in Nigeria, the recent attempt to pass the Protection from Internet Falsehood and Manipulation Bill 2020. Most of us know that more commonly as the Social Media Bill. And of course, for myself being a media practitioner, that in itself it carries a particular weight with me. Anyway, so this is basically a foundation for what civil society organizations are. And now I will introduce to you the guests that I have on the line. The first person who's on the line right now happens to be a lady who goes by the name of Idayat Hassan. Idayat is the director of the Center for Democracy and Development, CDD, forgive me, with health organizations going around, I'm almost calling it CDC. So yes, the CDD, which is Center for Democracy and Development, is an Abuja-based think tank that focuses on deepening democracy and development in West Africa. Idayat was formerly the principal program officer and team lead for the Democratic Governance Unit at the organization. Before joining the CDD, Idayat was a deputy regional coordinator with the movement against corruption. That's a movement that seeks to eradicate corruption and poverty in Nigeria. By profession, she is a lawyer and a development expert. She has participated in fellowships in several universities across Europe and America. Her core interests lie in development work and spans democracy, accountability, peace and security, and transitional justice in West Africa. Now, from that particular background I've given you on Idayat, you can tell, of course, that she isn't new to the civil society space. Now, our second guest happens to have, quite a bit under his belt as well. Dr. Husseini Abdu is a public intellectual, development and humanitarian specialist, activist, and leader. He is passionate about social justice and committed to human and environmental development. He has an extensive international strategic leadership experience that spans over 20 years. He is currently the country director of PAN International in Nigeria. You remember that the ambassador mentioned that earlier. And before assuming this position, Dr. Abdu happened to be the country director of Action Aid International. He has held other responsibilities in different international organizations. As the head of Action Aid International Democracy and Governance Program, he coordinated and developed the program in 23 different African countries, supporting state institutions and working closely with international and regional organizations, including the AU, ECOWAS, South African Development Corporation, the EU, the OECD, and the UN. He has had some interesting and pioneering advocacy in Africa and Europe, including advocacy on environment, education, HIV/AIDS, debt, youth participation, illicit financial flow, and development financing. Dr. Abdu happens to currently be the board chair of Yiaga Africa initiative. I've taken some time out to lay a proper foundation for you on what we're discussing and the two individuals that we will be discussing with. Without further ado, I'd like to say a big welcome to Idayat, Hassan, and Dr. Husseini Abdu. Thank you for joining us. My very first question would be for Idayat. Now, Nigeria's democratic development owes a lot to the work of various sectors of civil society, who not only fought for independence, but were also active in our return to democratic rule in 1999. They were also highly responsible for consolidating on our democracy over the past 21 years. They played a very active role. Now, would you say that civil society has remained as vibrant as it was 30 to 20 years ago? Do you think that anything has changed? How has civil society adapted since 1999?
Yeah, thank you very much, Nabilah, and it's a pleasure to be on this platform. I think that the last 21 years has actually been eventful. I was actually taught myself that in those years, pre-1999, it was the human rights movement. Then from 1999, it became what is referred to today as the civil society movement. Yeah, and I think that the last 21 years has been eventful, and it's changed actually. There are positives and there are negatives to everything, but you can't write away what civil society has had to do to sustain the democracy we've had in the last 21 years. A lot is attributed, a lot of changes, particularly in constitutional changes, the kind of constitutional amendment we have, the democracy work, the issue of inclusion, the issue of even health rights, poverty alleviation, a lot of the gains that we have experienced in the last 21 years can actually be attributed to the work of the Nigerian civil society movement. Yeah, pre-1999, what they did was actually to fight for the democracy that we enjoy today. But the consolidation of that democracy can actually be attributed to what we've all been doing in these 21 years. So I think kudos to them. Then I think one important thing that has also changed is the matter of strategy. So previously, in pre-1999, I think the strategy was more confrontational. than that of engagement, because you can understand that it's movement towards democracy. Now, while we still have confrontations, we also have very good partnership working with institutions within this country. Then there is a lot of knowledge production. There are lots of advocacy work, even as we continue to push back against a restrictive civic space. But we have contributed positively to the consolidation of democracy in Nigeria.
Okay, so Dr. Abdu, would you like to take a shot at that as well? Because I don't think we can take away your experience when we're having this particular conversation. What do you think about the change so far? I'm sure you agree with Idayat.
I think I agree with Idayat to a very large extent, that it is the role that the civil society played in the period before 1999 that led to what we have today as democracy. But whether this is what we demanded for or we bargained for, is a different ball game altogether, because our conception of democracy and what was at the fore of the struggle is actually not a proper, what we have today is not a proper reflection of it. But I think that the significant difference between the civil society of the period or under military rule and the civil society in the democracy, our own particular experience of democracy, is the fact that the ones we had under civil rule operated largely as a movement. We were a movement, and we have strong connections across those movements. Those who are on the human rights and pro-democracy movement, those on the labor movement, those in the student movement, those in the women's movement or the feminist movement, coalescing and coming together to struggle for a common cause. So you can easily talk about the labor unions. You can practically not be able to talk about Nigerian labor movement in those days without linking it to the pro-democracy activities. Or you talk about Women in Nigeria, which was a pioneer feminist group in the country, without actually finding a space for it in the struggle for democracy. Or the student movement. Even the movement or professional associations like the Nigerian Bar Association, like Academic Staff Union of Universities, were all parts of the larger pro-democracy movement. So it was the intensity and the activities of this movement that produced what we have today. But what has changed? What has changed is that we have seen a transition from this movement approach to civil society engagement to a more corporatization of civil society, where civil society organizations are becoming corporate entities, and therefore the mode of delivery are becoming more professional in terms of deliveries. And the professionalization of the civil society creates certain technical gaps, which takes away the energy that you have in the movement politics and the fluidity of a movement politics you don't have. So what we have today does not have the dynamism of the past, but it has a better technical depth. It has a better capacity, it has better knowledge, but it doesn't have the flair, it doesn't have the dynamism and that capacity to engage, to confront. And so basically as civil society, what we're supposed to be seeing is that expectation that we operate as a spectrum. That spectrum of leading from period of collaborations or corporations to confrontation. And that in between these two edges, there are a lot of things that happens there. So for me, this is the difference that I could see between the past and the present. No one is perfect on this, yes.
Dr. Abdu, do you think, with the foundation you've laid on that particular question, do you think that, by your own estimation that is, do you think that the current era of civil society organizations will achieve as much as what was achieved before 1999? That's considering all the things that you have just said.
It will, for sure, and I think Idayat did mention some of those gains. Some of the gains, unless you actually want to run a revolution, and even in the revolution, at the end of the day, you still have to go through other mechanisms. So we have to still work on these incremental gains that Idayat did mention. It is challenging. Like I mentioned, I actually think that We lost it significantly in the period of transition, where the politicians actually took over the process of the transition from democracy to civil rule. And then our expectations at that moment was that this civil rule was a transitional period, and then we are going to have a proper democracy. Unfortunately, the transitional period was badly hijacked, and therefore we have a system that is not too far from the past, which is of our military experience, and not too deep in our democratic aspirations. So I think the civil society is already doing what we need to do. How do we strengthen our elections and ensure that the elections is able to produce the right people that will lead the country? How can we change our laws, our constitutions, to make sure that the constitution reflects the realities of the country and deepen our democracy? What are those legislation that we need to put in place? And what are those processes that the state and its different institutions are putting in place that is shrinking the space? And how do we ensure that we don't allow that shrinking process to happen, and our struggle is always to expand the democratic space?
Dr. Abdu, I'm coming in here because I don't want you to, there's a particular question coming up later, and I don't want you to start touching on it because you seem to be going there at the moment. So let me come to Idayat. I have this question for you. Now, civil society, do you think it has made enough contributions to democratic consolidation? I mean, is it reflected in our actual democratic practices? Because, and I'm not talking just Nigeria, I'm talking about African democratic societies, because a lot has been said about the vibrancy of the African community and Africans' associational lifestyle. So do you think that civil society has done enough to actually reflect in our democratic practices?
Yes, and just to touch on briefly on what Hussaini was talking, it is important to know that the difference between 1999 and today is previously we had a system of solidarity. Now we have like a system of interest where you have people who are careerists. They are only in civil society because with very high degrees and possibly less committed to the shared value of the founding fathers like those days. So they move from one organization to the other. The lack of membership structure and strategies are some of those challenges we are facing. But I think that what is very key to actually note is that civil society has contributed positively to the democratic consolidation in Nigeria and all over the world itself. In fact, the absence of civil society will make a mockery of holding elections, for instance. What will be the essence of elections if there are no civil society? So it means, for instance, freedom of speech, freedom of expression, political thought will completely be taken away. But if I'm able to just zero down, civil society itself upholds the values that strengthen what we call civil society, and by us, citizenship. Who promotes inclusion? Who talks about the rights of minority? Who speak of the voiceless? And who talks about all those issues of discriminatory laws and practices itself? Is civil society who are positive agents. So if you look at the issue of young people's right to elections, you see the work Yiaga actually did with colleagues to get the Not Too Young to Run bill passed into law. That's one positive in the area of value, inclusion, protecting rights of minorities that you can actually say civil society has been doing. Then when we look in terms of free speech, expression, without those rights, where is political action actually positive? And again, going back to election being meaningful. But you see the work civil society has actually been doing in Nigeria and all over the world, talking and ensuring that those rights are actually respected and upheld by the government itself. There are several instances of civic group doing that, the media doing that. It's our work. We are monitoring, we are documenting, and we are ensuring that those rights are actually upheld. When we go again to political participation and elections, you find that civil society has been in the forefront of getting all this done. In fact, if you look at the history of constitutional review in Nigeria, you see that immediately the new administration came in, the first meeting with the AG was held by CDD. The next thing, they established a constitutional forum for citizens reform on the election. And somehow, the whole talk about elections started from 1999. Till date, we are taking up the issue of elections as individual organizations, the issue of constitutional amendment as individual organization, the issue of PWD rights. So it's replete in terms of the positive civil society has actually contributed towards democratic consolidation, both in terms of monitoring, both in terms of making sure that those rights are upheld and in improving inclusion in the whole democratic process itself.
Idayat, you've made very solid points, and I want to touch on something. Now, as far as Africa is concerned, I know that we hear a lot about African countries, and when it comes to election season, African countries seem to be under the spotlight for electoral malpractices and rigging, whatever it might be, that's the negative sides that accompany elections. I mean, even Nigeria, that has been something that has happened repeatedly with every electoral cycle that we've had. I know that a number of African countries are still expecting elections coming this year. I know that Tanzania, for instance, is preparing for elections by, I believe, November. But these are some of the countries that have come under scrutiny for blatant displays of electoral malpractice. And we know that when it comes to elections, civil society always comes up to talk about, those particular issues, always tries to find how to avoid the issues, and then if at all they do happen, how to discuss and get to some sort of neutral or positive ground, the way forward. But what happens when it seems like civil society is more talk than action? Because yes, I understand that this is like getting a boot to the behind, but I ask this because, I mean, when you talk civil society, for instance, they say media is the fourth estate of the realm, then maybe civil society might be the fifth, or civil society just comes hand in hand with democratic society. So what happens when it seems like it's all talk and no proper action?
I really don't believe that there is more talk than proper action. There are some areas people tend to actually gloss over. Deterrence is a very important aspect in the work that we do. So when you look at it and you talk about during elections, do people really understand how those election malpractices could have been worse without civil society monitoring the process? There is that issue of deterrence. There is the fact that for even every elections, like in Nigeria, we are going to Edo and we are going to Ondo elections. We know already that the political actors are preparing against the observer groups that will be coming, because we will be shedding light to the public. And who gives even evidence? There are lots of things. I think one of our biggest challenges as civil society has been communicating the work that we do and communicating very well to the people. Then taking up government also when they try to delegitimize us. That's part of the challenge. But in terms of even gathering evidence for petitions, do you know that civil society are now being subpoenaed to give evidence during election petition? Or we even give them most of those materials they plead during their home petitions. Even the political actors themselves are inviting us to come and observe so that we can actually judge the legitimacy or otherwise the credibility of the elections. Or otherwise, even citizens call up to us to want to know what our opinions are before they can actually make their own opinions. So I don't believe that it is more talk than action, because we have a deterrence, the deterrence in terms of reducing election of malpractices. We have the documentation work that we do, and we have the work where we even galvanize citizens to act, or organize citizens in different parts of the countries to resist forms of electoral violations And we have seen it happen in Kano, we've seen it happen in Bauchi, where people actually made extensive use of mandate protection, which is civil society organization that came up with that idea. Even in Lagos in 2015, we saw the elites, not just citizens, now stand around to protect their votes. Who is initiating all this? And I also don't really, if you go to Guinea today, the people who are resisting the referendum and the forthcoming elections and who are being killed are the civil society groups. They are fighting as against political parties. So I think we have to communicate better, and we have to start reacting to some of those actions that is being done to actually delegitimize us and the work that we do.
Okay, thank you very much for that answer. It was quite extensive. Now I want to come to Dr. Abdu. I had wanted to ask about civil society and the citizenry. I'd wanted to ask whether you think that civil society, how civil society organizations can actually make sure that citizens can build a strong democratic culture in Nigeria. Now, Idayat spoke a lot on what happened, especially during the last elections, and how the citizens took advantage of what civil society has done so far. But when you're talking democratic space, you're not just talking governance alone, because what comes to a person's mind is, oh, governance, we go and make these particular laws, and most of the time they're even only thinking about things like elections, again, for instance, or whatever the laws and policies might be at that particular point in time. But nobody is thinking about other things like how civil society opens up the space, for instance, for citizens to carry out, what would I call it now? To, let's say, for lack of a better word, let's say protest. Now, I realize that this word brings a lot into focus, especially considering the current situation in the US. But in Nigeria, you barely have that sort of response, especially outside of the online platform. So what do you think, Dr. Abdu, that civil society organizations can do to make sure that Nigerian citizens actually do become fully involved in the democratic process, and not just during every election cycle?
Thank you. There is always a strong relationship between citizens and their own societies, and that is the civil society. Because sometimes there is, once you remove the individual citizenship out and you organize, what you get is a civil society. So the civil society is actually in the civil space, and that civil space is the space of the citizens. And therefore, whatever the civil society does is actually supposed to be seen doing it in the interest of that society that it organizationally represents. At all times, it works, counterbalances the state. How does it actually hold the state to account? But many times our conversation on civil society has been very reductive. There's a tendency in the country, or even Africa generally, to often define civil society narrowly as just NGOs or organized bodies that people are actually aware of. Between the state and actually those organized ones, there are a lot of other organizational platforms that are civil society, that are engaging and are involved in their community activities, and also holding the state or other duty bearers to account. Because there are also duty bearers within our formation who are not necessarily government, but we see them within the framework of their relationship with government, which we call the state. So there's a lot going on. And I actually think that the role that the civil society is playing around this, it is capacity to mobilize and create a level of awareness amongst communities and amongst citizens to actually take certain actions that are in their interest. Many times, some of those actions are not necessarily protracted actions. They may actually be one-off actions that sometimes goes unnoticed. So if you go, for instance, and then you go to a community, and then you have a school, and then parents are able to put themselves together to probably organize around the school-based management committee and are able to influence conversations in the school and get the state school board or authorities responsible to take certain actions around the educational institution in that place, or a medical facility in a place, or they're able to take action and demand for water facility, that itself is an action. So there are several actions taking place, and these civil actions are not always necessarily have to do with elections, because there are different layers of participations. It's just, yes, electoral participation is one of the most important levels of participation, but there are different layers of participation that citizens are actually going through, that are actually part of our daily activities and our day-to-day lives, that sometimes we don't recognize, we don't document, and then we actually think that they are not part. So democracy is not simply about elections and how well we actually come out to vote, as important as election actually is. But the challenge I have is actually that there's so much emphasis on the normative parts of democracy, under some of those institutions and processes that are actually required in the democracy, and we lose the very important glue of democracy, which is the values part of a democracy. These normative processes are useless as long as there is no corresponding values to keep them. So at all times we are talking about more laws about corruption or public accountability. But if there is no values, if people don't share, there is no shared value on accountability, no matter what laws you actually put in place, they will definitely find ways of circumventing such laws. So how are we projecting such values? If people don't believe in participation and they actually don't see the value, they don't share that values of citizens' participation, no matter what laws you put in place, they will resist it. And that is why the state governments are not interested in local governance, because local governance is about citizens' participation at the local level. Because local government will create different demands for accountabilities for them. So I think that one of the major gaps of our work is that we play high premium on those higher level normative issues and probably lose sense of the value-based concerns that are needed for those normative things to actually work. Because in reality, the systems don't run themselves. People run those systems. And if those people running the system don't have these values, you have a challenge. Thank you.
Dr. Abdu, on this note about the value system of, a society, what do you think that other aspects of civil society, because every time, like you said, every time we hear civil society, a lot of people only think about the organizations that hold government to account as far as democracy is concerned, or electioning and all of that. But where is now the role of trade unions, social movements, grassroots organizations, online networks, for instance, and communities, and also faith groups? Because a lot of people tend to forget that, especially in Nigeria, we tend to forget that our faith-based groups are also a big part of civil society.
Yes, even the media is part of civil society. And I heard you talking about the fourth estate of the realm. And that's an important element of Nigerian civil society. Historically, as a country, even right from our colonial time, Nigeria has always had a very irrepressible civil society, irrepressible media, and this is not because the laws allowed it to have that, but there is a lot of history attached to it. Even when you put all the restrictive laws, despite some of the authoritarian experiences we had under military rule, Nigeria still had a very vibrant media, including a survival approach that was put on, which we call the guerrilla media. Which was just hitting and running and producing as it goes. So I actually think that there's a strong room for this social movement, and whether it's a trade union or it's a professional associations. And there's a lot going on in terms of trying to provide this interface across these different democracy platforms and civil society organizations. But increasingly as we work is that, like what Idayat was trying to talk about, interest issues actually emerge. And where interest issues are involved, sometimes compromises become quite a big challenge, and actually agreeing on the solidarity issue that she was talking about becomes a concern. But occasionally, we are able to agree on different actions and are able to take collective actions. There are some very important protests that Nigerians have had in the last 21 years, which has actually helped in shaping the character of our democracy. But it's just that we are not able to do it consistently and sustainably, and that's what we need to do. And the second dimension of it is that, look, the new space that we have, because we are currently as civil society operating in a virtual space and in a physical space. And sometimes there is no relationship between the virtual space and the physical space. And the challenge is that how do we connect the virtual space and the physical space? For instance, if you check, there is more protest going on in the virtual space than in the physical space. So how do we get the anger that we express in the virtual space to reflect the realities of what we do in the physical space? It's one of the main challenges that we need to do for those of us interested in it. The second one is that the virtual space is increasingly becoming a space also for uncivil activities. So because we should just recognize that there is no homogeneity in civil society in terms of values, and then because they are also uncivil civil society, that what they espouse, what they stand for, their organization, they are operating below the state and above family, but what they espouse does not promote or advance the cause of democracy. And we say that they are actually uncivil in their actions. Also, if people organize and form a cult group and they're expressing violence on people, or you take Boko Haram, for instance, its initial formation was probably, you could call it like a civil society, but it has become an uncivil civil society to some extent, and even more as an armed group. So there are different expressions of it, and they are the hard expressions of uncivil attitude, and there's a soft expression of uncivil attitude. The soft dimension is the issues around ethnic divides, hate messaging, false and fake news that are deliberately designed to cause havoc in the society. So those those cases are becoming increasingly deep in our virtual space. And so if I'm having a conversation with Idayat, the discussion we are going to have will be strongly around what we can do to advance the cause of democracy in our country. But again, when you go to the virtual space, somebody is actually out there passing the message that is probably trying to put a wedge between me and her, for instance. So that's the context in which we are operating. And this context does not exist in the past. Even when it existed in the past, we were operating at the physical space, and we could meet each other in those physical spaces and engage each other on those physical spaces. But the virtual space provides room for anonymity. You don't actually know who is actually saying it, and you are not very clear about it, but the messages can actually be very powerful, so powerful that it can actually undermine the cause that we all stand for. But in terms of engagement and collective engagement, solidarity, and taking common action, yes, we are doing it, but we are not doing it as much as we could. Actually, we should be able to do it. But why, again, for me, is that we are in a political dispensation. That's a democracy. Interests are diverse. Sometimes some of us, even at the level that we operate, there are certain alliances that sometimes also undermine some of those things.
Thank you, Dr. Abdu. I can see that a few questions have started coming in online. I want to ask Idayat this question before I start to take those. So for those of you, if you're watching and you have a question, please, you can just keep dropping them and I'll get to them in a minute. Now, Idayat, recently there have been a lot of attempts to regulate, to muzzle civil society and, its operations in Nigeria, especially specific organizations and the interests that they are tailored to. Now, do you think that this poses, it's an obvious question, yes, but do you think it poses a threat to building a democratic culture? And what are the steps that the state needs to take what can citizens do to protect civil society in a democratic system like ours?
One other thing we don't do well as civil society, and broadly and expansively defined, is that we have tend to focus more on teaching rights and not talking about duties. So that was what Hussaini was talking about when he was talking about we all live in this space. So we have to do more in terms of teaching citizens also their duties to the state. It also helps in terms of getting our work better done. Now, it's very important to note that in the last 5 years, there has been lots of attempts to restrict the civic space. And this attempt comes in different ways. There has been crackdown on civic rights activists, bloggers, leaders of religious indigenous movements. In fact, I recently read a report which was actually noting that between 2015 May and 2017 May 29, 103 infractions were recorded. I think it was done by Spaces for Change. And when we were plotting and looking at 20 years, we find that these restrictions in the last 5 years has become much more aggravated. So it's important to point that. So there has been that. Then there has also been a tide of restrictive legislations. So it's not just clamping down or crack down, as you might want to talk about it, but there has been lots of restrictive legislation of recent against civil society and civic rights. So the Non-Governmental Regulatory Commission's bill was one introduced in the last National Assembly, another one recently killed, social media bill, hate speech bill. All of this makes it very difficult to operate. We have to start working more in terms of partnership, because if we have to go back to the drawing board, go back to pre-99 era, which things are gradually going up to, and with the rise of social movements, which is also taking away agency from those they can actually hold on to. I think that democratic consolidation might actually be a long way for Nigeria to come. And even if we situate all this within the COVID-19 context, where it's become very, very obvious that trust is lacking. The citizens do not trust the government, but possibly they have more trust in most instances in their civil society organizations. And by civil society, I mean broad, expansive definition of civil society, which includes the community-based organization, the media, the faith-based association, and so on and so forth.
Those comments were quite insightful. Let's hear from Farouk Ibrahim. I believe that we should be able to hear from Farouk. Farouk is also a representative of Yiaga Africa. Farouk is the program manager, governance and development unit. That's Ibrahim Farouk.
Thank you very much, and thank you to Dr. Abdu for a wonderful conversation, and to Idayat, Hassan, thank you so much. And we're glad that we've had this series of conversations with the Embassy of Sweden, which is here in Nigeria. The conversation started off with women's participation, with women as pillars of influence in our democracy. And last week we spoke about the increased engagement of young people in our democracy as well. And today we're ending the conversation with the role of civil society in democratic societies. And we're grateful to all our speakers and to our moderator and to the partnership with the Embassy of Sweden. And I'm sure we'll continue to engage on these issues moving forward. And like Dr. Abdu said, it's important for us to take these conversations from a virtual space down to the physical space, and I'm sure we look forward to doing that as well.
Thank you, Ibrahim. That was Ibrahim Farouk on behalf of Yiaga Africa. At this point, we're going to go over to the Embassy of Sweden, where the ambassador is at hand to give his closing remarks. Ambassador, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Thank you for these enlightening discussions and very heated, I would say also. I mentioned in the beginning that cooperation and collaboration between civil society organizations is very important. And I mentioned the umbrella network that I think perhaps is missing sometimes in Nigeria. But I'd like to stress as well that, of course, the official authorities and ministries and politicians have to listen to civil society. I mean, that is part of democracy, that ministers receive delegations from different civil societies to listen to them, not necessarily agree, but to get their view and to get a range of different views before they take decisions. So this connection is really crucial to democracy. I just want to stress it. I'm not sure that is the case in Nigeria, though, but still. And once more, Nabilah, Usman, and Farouk Ibrahim as well, thank you so much for the cooperation that we had with Yiaga. It was really
Hello and welcome.
Early.
Conversations around democracy.
First, revisit the institutions of democracy.
Thank you for these discussions that you give different perspectives of the Swedish government to support democracy in Nigeria, but especially as I thank you for the cooperation with Yiaga.